All right,
Cool. It's
here we
rolling.
go. All right, welcome to the first community meeting of February 2021. For those that are joining outside the community, even right now, we don't have anybody, but I just want to make the statement that abide by our code of conduct, read and abide by it while you are in this meeting. And that is listed on the notes. So if you need to find the code of conduct, it is in the agenda notes at the top. I will just kind of go through those who have input anything, and then if you have anything to add at the end after the status updates are given, feel free to do that, chime in. But I will go for the first one. Margot, let me share my screen. All right. So Margot, do you want to talk about what you put in here?
Yeah, so I've been working on the Impersonation Proxy track, trying to make it possible for clusters that are cloud hosted to be able to use Pinniped. And so I think Matt's also probably going to talk about some of the other stuff, but one of those pieces was detecting cloud-hosted environments. So like if we can tell that you're running on GKE or EKS, then we can use that information to spin up an impersonation proxy for you. And if you're running on kind, then we don't need to.
Cool. I can go next. Had a few items here. One kind of minor thing I did this week was hooked up codecov.io to our repo, so it tracks our coverage data and leaves these comments telling on each pull request telling you whether you made coverage better or worse. I can see how this could be annoying. So I wanted to just take a moment to get like a gut check. Do folks feel like this is useful or noisy or like you're not sure yet?
So I will admit, I have not worked with many projects that have these tools, but the ones I have worked with that have them, I completely just tune them out. Like it's just noise because it's not usually actionable for me. Like it doesn't encourage me to write more tests.
So I think the use case I have for it is not so much on my own PRs. It's reviewing other people's PRs, and I can go look at your tests and I can try and figure out what you actually covered in tests. But it's nice to just look at the bot and say like, oh yeah, they probably added the test that I don't know.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't mind it. I'm very used to like 18 bots showing up and yelling at you every time you open the PR.
Yeah.
So like one more is not like not a problem.
We just so everybody knows, there are a bunch of settings we can still tune on that. Like we can actually leave the bot enabled, but turn off the comment posting, so it tracks the coverage in the background. You can go to that website and look at it, but it doesn't actually. Anyway, we have options. Next status item, I worked on a design for some of the API changes related to the impersonation proxy feature. Mark and I worked together on some of that earlier in the week, and I think we actually, I filed a bunch of GitHub issues centered around one particular design, and then I think we decided that may not be the right design. So later in the agenda here, I've got like a full-on discussion about a second design that I like better. This week I wrote a blog post. I think a lot of you already took a look at it, but give it a read. We'll plan to post this like today, I think, and cut 050. And I guess, yeah, we're cutting 050 today, so that's good. Thanks, everyone.
Do you want to go a little bit more in depth to?
Yeah. Okay. So this blog post I think is not it doesn't quite fit the pattern that we might have in other releases where we write a blog post announcing the release and talking about all the cool new features that we shipped in the release, because the feature that we're shipping in this release is pretty small and it's only interesting to some niche cases. Most Pinniped users won't care about this feature at all. So what I thought was interesting to blog about was not the feature itself, but kind of how we built it in the API machinery. And that it might be interesting to other developers who write Kubernetes controller apps. So that's what I focused on. And we'll see. I expect that this may get some positive attention, but also may get some negative attention. We'll see. I think that's I wrote it expecting that. So.
Why the expectation of negative attention? Is it?
Just because it's a little hacky. Okay. I mean, it's the best thing we can do right now, but it's a little hacky.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I was where on the 050 release, like I saw yesterday Ryan and Margot had opened a PR, so I was trying to figure out, do we feel current main is 050?
Yeah. Do we want to have some live discussion about that? I read the comments and I still don't know if I have an opinion one way or the other. Maybe we could add a discussion topic for that. I can do that when I'm done here. And the last thing I wanted to mention is welcome back, Pablo. We've been having discussions about roadmap stuff, and I guess that will be a good point to hand over to Pablo.
Yep. Thanks. I'm glad to be back. It's day 3, I guess. So mostly catch up with the team and trying to get a sense of what's going on with in-flight work, as well as how the team has been thinking about upcoming initiatives. I got some of that information. I think I scheduled some meetings with the team over the next, 2 weeks that will help us make some decisions that will inform. When I say a short-term roadmap, I'm thinking roughly 6 iterations, and then those will also be foundational for a longer-term roadmap. Also, as I work a little bit more closely with Dan to understand some of the specific outcomes we believe that we're trying to drive, specifically with Pinniped as it exists kind of in a broader umbrella of stuff. I know that's rather ambiguous. I hope that next week I can speak a little bit more clearly on what that actually means. But yeah, happy to be back.
Cool. We skipped over Ryan and Andrew and Mo. If you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I intentionally skipped over them.
Yes, next time add it to the doc.
But Andrew, do you have anything that you want to?
No, it just mostly was helping with the 050 release this week.
Cool. And Mo, Ryan.
I was working with Andrew and Mo and building the features that we were just talking about.
Cool.
I've actually been sort of busy on some of the downstream efforts for upcoming.
Yeah, I've been seeing that. That seems like a lot of fun.
No comment.
All right, discussion topics. Review API design proposal.
Yeah. Okay. So I posted this earlier in the week, so maybe folks had a chance to read it. This is a proposal about the API changes that go along with the new impersonation proxy feature. I don't think it necessarily changes that much about actually how the code works to implement the impersonation proxy. It's mostly about how do you configure and describe the status of the impersonation proxy. So this is a departure from what we have filed as sort of stories right now in GitHub. Goals were to make the concierge work with no configuration in as many cases as possible. I think that's been our goal since we started, was most cases should work with no config. You just install Pinniped and it works correctly. I also wanted to leave room in the API so that we can eventually configure everything that might ever need to be configured about how it behaves, even if right now we don't have all those knobs yet. And then I also really wanted to get rid of the credential issuer resource. And I don't know if I justified very well why I want to get rid of it, but it's mostly because I don't like having a singleton API. Like it's kind of a weird API pattern. I think it's not obvious why most people would care about that resource anyway, because it's actually none of our CLIs, for example, use it anymore at all. Our CLI used to read it, but it doesn't anymore. I just thought this would be a good chance if we're reorganizing things a little bit. We could also get rid of that. Non-goals, I don't necessarily intend to add all the configuration knobs from like the version that we ship next. I think we just need to leave space in the API so that we can add them later. So the changes I broke down here, the first one, you can scroll down a little. The first one here is basically the change that Margot talked about, which is start adding some auto detection of when the impersonation proxy is needed. And we could make this fancier later on, but like the simplest place to start is just, are we running on one of the 3 major hosted cloud provider cluster types? And they're all, Margot, I hope I'm not wrong, but they're all relatively easy to detect because they all use like labels on the node objects, since you can just make a little API call and tell if you're on one of those. So in the next version of Pinniped, after the one we shipped today, we would detect that we are in one of those environments. And if we are in one of those environments, generate and persist a CA, which we have code to do. That's sort of just a few lines of new code to turn that on. Create a service of type load balancer. And then when it has an external name assigned, which might take a minute, we load that external name in and then issue a serving certificate for the external name and basically use that to serve the impersonation proxy. So all of this is basically just sort of like one little controller that takes a bunch of code we've already written, uses it to do this new thing. I think if you could go back up for just a second, there's a bunch of cloud provider specific annotations that could be useful in certain scenarios, but I don't think we need any of them to make the feature work in this version. It just would just be a load balancer service. Okay, and then the next thing, second change, is take the status information that currently we kind of keep in the credential issuer API and start putting it in a new status field of the authenticator objects instead. So we already have like some common types between the JOT authenticator and the token webhook authenticator. This would just be like another common type in the status that represents the way that the concierge is serving that authenticator currently. So it's a status of how to use that authenticator in the cluster, which is kind of what the credential issuer is today. The slightly awkward thing about this is that it is basically the same information on each authenticator object. So if you had 100 authenticator objects, that would be pretty wasteful. But in most scenarios, you have like 1. And even in more complex scenarios, you probably have like 2 or 3 or 5. So that doesn't feel that bad to me. I have an example of what I think the API should look like here.
If I could make a comment
Yeah.
there.
Please.
The copy the same information 1,000 times is a Kubernetes pattern. Note the root CA publisher. There is no global config map that has this singleton object. It is copied via controller into a known location in every single namespace.
Yeah.
So totally fine. This is well within exactly what Cube would tell you to do.
Yeah. So in this object, the spec and the metadata and everything, that's what our API looks like today already. The new part in the status field is this concierge strategies field, which tells you for each type of strategy that we support, and that's the name that we use right now. I'm open to changing that name. I think strategy is a little bit generic word. We have basically the existing strategy that the concierge uses today, which is the token credential request API, and we can report on whether that's successful or not, and we can report on if it's successful, its API endpoint and the CA you use to talk to it. And that's what you need to then build a kube config that targets that strategy. And then the new section then is the impersonation proxy, which turns out to be almost all the same fields. That's kind of an accident though. Like the fact that in both cases what you need is a URL and a CA bundle. It's kind of an accident. They're actually kind of semantically different fields. But again, that's the information that you need to connect to the impersonation proxy in a kubeconfig. And then for backwards compatibility, we can take the status information and we can continue to maintain the credential issuer for another release or two, just in case anybody's depending on it. We can mark it deprecated in 060. And then finally, this is basically the space that I want to add. The space that I want to reserve for future configuration is then in the config map configuration of the concierge. So I think almost all of the things that you would want to configure about how the concierge works are things that you would know when you installed it. So I like that, for example, on the supervisor, I like that you can come back and dynamically reconfigure it with a new IDP. I think that's really powerful and useful. I don't think it's necessarily useful to dynamically reconfigure the concierge to operate in some different mode, because it's a component that you would probably deploy like as a cluster add-on, and you would kind of know when you installed it, kind of the parameters that you wanted to use. So the initial in 060, this section would just be empty. We wouldn't actually have any new config. Some point after 060, we would add some config, and some things we could configure are this mode, which would be either forcing the impersonation proxy to be on or forcing it to be off, and the default could be the 060 behavior, which is detect cloud providers, basically. I think it's detect cloud providers or something, maybe a fancier heuristic than just detecting cloud providers. Maybe we can find another heuristic that gets us to like be correct in more percentage of cases.
Question on this config stuff.
Yeah.
For 060, are you proposing any config change to the config map?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no config at all.
Okay. And I was going to ask, if we are going down the route of having in the future more sort of elaborate config for our config map, like just more and more stuff in there, it might be a good idea for us to start like versioning that config just like we do all of our extras.
Yeah. I mentioned that in Slack, but yeah, we could add an API version, even though it's not. I don't expect it to be a Kubernetes object.
Yeah.
In the API, it's just a way, like the way that Kind uses versioned configs for static files. So yeah, and I mentioned too, like this section of the config that I'm talking about would also be a place if we want to add configuration for the kubecert agent behavior, we could add that into. But again, this is basically like future API work. The example here I gave. Something else important in the config. If we scroll back up for a second, something that I think we'll want to be able to do in the future is disable the automatic creation of that load balancer service and let the user configure that out of band. So say like maybe load balancing doesn't work in my cluster, but I have a host port I forwarded correctly, and I know the external name of that host. I know the external endpoint that you use to connect to that, and I know what CA bundle I want to use. So you should basically be able to statically configure all of that if you want to, and if you do that, then we wouldn't create the load balancer service, but we would still like run the proxy. Okay, so the first example, this would be on a cluster where on a Kind cluster, where the token credential request API works. So you can see that it has a success status, and then the impersonation proxy would be disabled because it would be in this auto mode where it detected that it wasn't on a cloud provider cluster, and so it just turned itself off. The second example is the other case where you are on a cloud provider cluster, and so the token credential request API right now would still attempt to run, but it would error out. We could make this fancier, but it would error out, and then the impersonation proxy would start up, and it would have this connection information. And then, yeah, one alternative API idea is just a structural thing about how that strategy status information is laid out. I think this is like a style question. I don't really know what the right answer is. In the first in the main examples, each of the strategies has its own status type. In this example, like they share a common strategy status object that then has like some specific information under it. I don't know what the right answer is. Okay. Sorry. That was a long read through. I wanted to make sure there's some comments that I wanted to get to that are further up in the doc. Nancy, if you want, I'm happy to share too if you want to. Either way.
You want to drive?
Yeah, I don't mind.
All right.
I could tell I was getting bossy. No, that's the wrong doc. This one. Okay, so one question was about I think I kind of addressed this. The example at the bottom. We can talk more about that. The implementation. I think essentially we just need like some in-memory cache of like what the status of each of the strategies is, and then in our authenticator controller we can have a controller that copies that into the status of each authenticator. I'm not sure exactly what the implementation would look like, but I try to mostly focus on the API design in this doc. But it seems feasible to me that you would have some piece of code that when the status of one of the strategies changes, it broadcasts that out and applies it to all the current authenticators. And then maybe in the authenticator controller, when a new authenticator is created, it needs to go pull that in. It might be a little bit complicated. Like I think there might be two paths that actually set that status, or we'd have to like make a informer, basically make a fake informer that feeds the existing controller code. I don't know. Mo, you may have ideas about how we do this.
Yeah, it's not that bad. You just need to be able to reference one from the other. It's not bad.
Yep. And then this was another good question about can we get away without having any config in 060? Because if we do that and we always have just this auto detect mode, we won't be able to test this code in kind. We'll have to only test it in the cloud provider clusters, which I think is a legit concern. We could start with just a really basic config that just forces it to be on, and that would be enough for testing, I think. We could even, I think I mentioned, we could even do that with like an environment variable that we really don't expose as an API at all yet. Because even though load balancer services don't work in kind, the cluster IP part of the load balancer service does work. You can actually talk to it through Squid. So I think we could make a test work in that way. I'd also be willing to accept that like this functionality only gets tested on real cloud provider clusters. That we just have to maybe pull one of those cluster types into our PR pipeline. Then
Could I add a comment there?
Yeah.
I feel like we should not, because it's easy to test this in kind. I feel like we shouldn't give up what we have today, which is that you could run all the integration tests on your laptop. They all run immediately early in the pipeline. And it would also be nice to do what you said as well, to add a real GKE cluster or a real AKS cluster to make sure it really works there as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think it should be impossible to get this to test in kind. And I know like
really easy, right?
Yeah, it shouldn't be hard.
Let it run, let the service run. You don't have to do anything special for a load balancer.
The only thing that might need a little bit extra work is if we have a controller that creates the load balancer service and then wants to read the external name that gets put there. Nothing in kind would ever set that external name field. That's how you would kind of know that it wasn't working. So we might have to, in our test, reach out and pretend that it got an external name and just set that field. But that would be fine.
I would be in favor of like I don't know, cube does cube underscore. So I would say like pinniped underscore unsupported underscore force enable. Whatever.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's very much work to go ahead and add the little config section here and just have just these config fields.
Yeah, I mean, I would
In
say
06.
maybe auto and force, not necessarily in disable.
Yeah.
Disable even means right now.
So
I think part of this will come down to how good we think we can do auto detection. I don't think we have a solution at the moment. The library that we were looking into, I think, isn't going to work well for auto detecting. Maybe we can find a different approach.
Okay. Those are the main questions, and then I think the last comment was about basically first of all, I guess I want to ask, is this, Ryan, what you had in mind as like another type of API structure? Roughly?
That's more similar to what we came up with for today's existing API. I don't feel strongly about it. I remember we had a bunch of conversations when we designed the credential issuer API, and this is what we came up with. But
yeah.
I don't know if there's any huge advantage to it being an array. I think we, at the time, if I remember right, I think we were thinking about like, if you were going to write the client side code, which would be easier for the client side code to look at. And I think we lean towards an array for that reason.
Yeah, having it as an array lets the server express a preferred ordering, which seems interesting. Like if we have things in the future that we think are better, then the client can just loop through this array and choose the first kind that it understands how to do.
Client side more, maybe I could you like very carefully explain the difference between the two? I'm looking at them in my YAML.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is
array versus map.
Yeah, this is an array where each entry of the array describes the status of a particular strategy. And all of these fields are all like one type. Here and here, you're looking at like the same type. And then because each strategy has some strategy specific like configuration status, there has to be this extra little sort of tagged union field inside there that has the specific data for if the impersonation proxy is working, here's how to connect to it. And there would be a similar little tagged union field for the token credential request API. That's different from here, where this is not an array, it's just a object with two fields. That each of these fields then is a totally different type. So actually this status field here and this status field here are two different Go type members, struct members. So I think if you write code that handles this, it looks like a bunch of if statements. If you write code that handles this type, it looks like a for loop that loops over things.
I mean, isn't the client just gonna? So I'm thinking about a client of this authentication thing, and isn't the client just gonna want to know where do I make my HTTP connection, and like maybe what do I use for a proxy, what do I use for a CA bundle, what do I use for API path, something like that.
Yeah, so the client that would actually be reading the status information is mostly the pinniped get kubeconfig command. So when you run pinniped get kubeconfig, you would say which authenticator do you want to use. It would go read that authenticator status and say, oh, if I want to use that authenticator, I can tell that it's running in impersonation proxy mode. So the kind of kubeconfig I need to target that is one where, for example, the server and the CA and the kubeconfig point at the proxy, and then the command that's embedded inside there is the version of the command that wraps up the token for the proxy. So I think the client we're talking about here is that get kubeconfig command. And then you can also imagine like other downstream cases where they copy that status information up somewhere else but end up pulling it down and basically using it through some other data path.
One very small advantage of an array is if the user installs Pinniped and they forcibly say, please do not run the impersonation proxy if we support that option, then the server could just omit the entry from the array. It just wouldn't be there at all.
That's true. I would almost think we would still have it there and have it say disabled by config or something like that, so it's obvious. One other thought I had is that with this shape of API, this is a really trivial thing, but in this shape of API, we could pull out the status fields of each of the strategies and actually pull them up into the column output of get the kubectl output. So as I do kubectl get jot authenticators, I would see here's an authenticator, it's running in impersonation proxy mode. That I think is harder to just describe in the Open API if it's an array. I don't know. we could solve that a lot of other ways. That we could have like a summary status here that says like this is ready and it's in whatever mode. I don't know. Also, I mean, something else to note about the API here is that it doesn't prevent a particular authenticator from having both strategies working, which I think is something we want. In case we add in the future a new strategy, and we want to keep one of these old strategies around for existing clients, but have something new that's newer and better, that should work okay.
I think when we had that discussion in the past, it seemed like people didn't want to keep the other stuff around if we, like, say, got stuff upstream. Is that, I don't know.
Good
like,
question. Yeah,
like, if we got something less hacky,
yeah.
do we want to keep the hacky stuff?
Maybe. So I did also, that was another thing, I guess. I did try to use, this is partly just kind of an example. I don't know if this is the exact string we'll use, but I tried to describe this strategy as the token credential request API, not necessarily the use the kube signing cert API or strategy. Like we if we have a future implementation that uses the CSR API to get certificates, it doesn't really matter from the client's perspective, because basically all the client needs to know is that the token credential request API is working. So that may be part of it. I think the other part of your question though is, yeah, in the future we might make some design decision about what to support and what not to support. But at least we have the option structurally in the API. If we want to keep supporting old stuff, we could.
Separate from that concern, it's also nice that you can run both strategies at the same time, again, for testing reasons. Yeah. Another side effect of having the API structured this way that I think is interesting, I don't know if it's useful, but I think it's interesting, is you could have different authenticators that support different subsets of strategies. So one example is I could imagine a strategy, maybe a future strategy that did some transport level credential binding. So meaning like a client certificate. That wouldn't work over this API. It wouldn't work with this strategy, but it would work on the impersonation proxy. And so we could actually say, hey, that this future like cert authenticator, client cert authenticator, is publishing a different set of strategies than the token authenticator on the same cluster. So anyway, I don't want to drag on too long here. Do folks feel like we can move forward with this? I think we maybe need a little more investigation into how good of a job we think we can auto detect these particular cluster types. But assuming we can figure that out.
Okay. That's fair. I think it's good that we've started that work already.
I don't think that actually, if we decide that we can't do a good job auto detecting, I don't think it actually changes the design very much. Then it just becomes a manual enable, disable, and maybe a manual auto give me a load balancer or never give me a load balancer would become the two options.
Yeah, that's another detection strategy we could use instead of having it trying to specifically detect like these 3 cloud providers, which hard coding like detection of 3 specific cloud providers is kind of janky. We could also try to detect, do load balancer services work on this cluster or not, by creating one and waiting for it to get an external name. That would be also a valid way to kind of detect kind clusters versus other clusters. I think Mo dropped off the call, but the one problem that Mo had mentioned with that is on a cluster that has both of the current strategies working, we actually don't really want to use the impersonation proxy unless we have to. Like, so if the token credential request API works, it'd be better to not even run the impersonation proxy at all. And that's awkward because of how kind of eventually consistent all of our logic for creating this is. Okay. I think
that's another. You were mentioning if the API is an array, then the server could kind of insert its priority decision by giving the order. Well, I guess we could do that on the client side too. We could put priority decisions on the client side.
Yeah, I feel like I did maybe.
Spin it up still.
Yeah.
Like even if the client isn't using it, I guess if you're running it.
I feel like I did. I think I did change my mind. I think I do like this API structure better. Now that we talked about it, so I'll probably rewrite this. Okay. Did Mo leave a comment about where he went?
He's joining an upstream meeting.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Can I ask? This is going to seem remedial, but this is largely because I just got back.
Yeah.
This design, is this the design that y'all have moved ahead with for the in-flight story that's around the minimal impersonation proxy? Or is there more here that we haven't actually prioritized yet in terms of additional API work?
The work so far, so I think there's sort of 2 pieces of work so far. One is just the runtime behavior, the runtime implementation of running the proxy, which is actually independent of all of this. So this is all just like how we tell how to run the proxy or when to run the proxy or whether to run the proxy. In the case where we do run the proxy, we have that code now, essentially. Maybe it's not completely done, but it's there. Then the other work item is the detection of detecting these different cloud provider environments, which I think is, I don't know, Marco, do you have any status? It sounded like the status was the first thing we tried didn't work very well.
With the auto detection stuff, I don't know. Ryan pointed out that we could pretty easily detect that you were on like that you were on AWS, but not necessarily AKS specifically. Or I don't know, the same, like right where it's hosted and not necessarily the type of cluster, where like theoretically you could spin up your own on their servers.
Yeah, there's a bunch of
be actually the same, and it wouldn't be like cloud hosted in the way that we're interested in.
Yeah. I think there's enough metadata in the cluster that I'm confident we can find a good heuristic. Because like there's the node, the field on the node object, which I think is the thing we started with, I think has the problem you're mentioning. There's also like the version info of Kubernetes, and most of the providers ship a version of Kubernetes where the version string is specific and has the name of the provider in it. Another thing is looking at the node objects and finding the nodes that are labeled as control plane nodes. And if you don't find nodes labeled control plane nodes, then you're probably on a cluster that's not self-hosted. Anyway, maybe we do need to. So what I'm looking at the issues here. This is the story that's finished but not delivered because we haven't merged. We were basically waiting for 050 to land. This story I think goes away, maybe, or maybe we rename it to just add one field to our config map to do the force enable. This is the status information, so it needs to be rewritten to say that you discover this information via the authenticator status. So we can take that after this. And then these two stories actually stay exactly the same, I think. So, and then maybe there's another issue for the auto detection.
Yeah, I think that's a separate issue. Those last two stories there's already work for those on the impersonation proxy branch. I anticipate that changing with the implementation of the new authenticator spec. But there's already stuff in flight there. I think the branch is kind of the impersonation proxy branch at the moment is kind of an amalgamation of a few different stories and isn't quite easily teased out into that minimal impersonation proxy, this story, that story, just because we've been kind of holding stuff back until 050.
That makes sense. Okay, so the last agenda item, Nancy, I can turn it back over to you if you want, or I'm happy to just finish this out. The last agenda item is about this story, or this PR, which we may or may not want to ship today in the release, and we may or may not want to merge. I've read this issue and I feel like I didn't really understand it, and I don't really have an opinion. I know that Mo had an opinion, so maybe we just need to table this and talk about it when Mo's back. I don't know.
We should try to talk to him as soon as possible,
Yes.
after this call.
After this call, because we would like to cut the release in an hour. Yeah. Okay. I think that's fine. Cool. Window shoutouts this week, I guess. But we're here. We're waiting.
Okay, so anything else anyone wants to bring up before we sign off? No? All right, well, thanks everyone for joining the community meeting. If you're watching this from home after it's been recorded, please join us live for the next Pinniped community meeting that's happens every first and third Thursday of the month. So today is the first Thursday, and we will meet again on the third Thursday of February. So we will see you then, hopefully. Than that, thank you.